The patrol believed the area was lightly defended. Intelligence reports suggested scattered guerrilla activity, nothing more. Within hours, that assumption would cost an American battalion nearly half its fighting strength and expose fundamental flaws in how the United States was fighting the war in Vietnam. October 1967. The Vietnam War had entered its third year of major American ground involvement. Across South Vietnam, U.S. forces conducted search and destroy operations designed to locate and eliminate Viet Cong units before they could threaten government-controlled areas. The strategy relied on superior firepower, helicopter mobility, and the assumption that American units could dictate the terms of engagement. Commanders in Saigon reviewed maps and reports that suggested progress was being made. Enemy body counts were rising. Territory was being cleared. The war, they believed, could be won through attrition and aggressive patrolling. In the dense forests near the Cambodian border, that assumption was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. The area around Ông Thanh, a small clearing in Tây Ninh province, had seen limited enemy contact in previous weeks. American commanders believed the region contained dispersed Viet Cong forces that could be engaged and defeated through aggressive patrolling. These assessments were based on reconnaissance flights, reports from local sources, and the absence of major engagements in recent months. The intelligence painted a picture of an area where the enemy was present but not concentrated, where American units could move with relative freedom and call in devastating firepower if they encountered resistance. It was a picture that bore almost no resemblance to reality. The 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, received orders to sweep through the area as part of Operation Shenandoah II. The battalion had been in Vietnam for several months and had experienced combat, but nothing on the scale of what awaited them in the jungle ahead. The soldiers were young, many barely out of their teens. They had trained for jungle warfare, but training could not replicate the suffocating density of Vietnamese forests, or the psychological weight of moving through terrain where every shadow could conceal an enemy position. They trusted their officers, their equipment, and the doctrine that had been drilled into them. They believed that American technology and firepower made them superior to any enemy they might face. Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen Jr. commanded the battalion. He was the son of a distinguished World War II general who had led the 1st Infantry Division in North Africa and Sicily. Allen carried both the weight and pride of that legacy. He had been trained in the conventional warfare that had won the previous war: clear objectives, massed formations, overwhelming firepower applied at decisive points. He believed in the effectiveness of American training and the moral certainty of the mission. His orders were to move through the jungle, locate enemy forces, fix them in place, and destroy them with the support of artillery and air power. The plan was based on doctrine that had proven effective in previous wars. It did not account for an enemy that refused to fight on American terms, that had studied U.S. tactics for years, and that had been watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The terrain itself was the first obstacle that intelligence failed to adequately address. The forests near Ông Thanh were not the open rice paddies or accessible highlands where American forces had previously found success. This was triple canopy jungle, thick vegetation layered so densely that sunlight barely reached the ground. The upper canopy formed a continuous roof of leaves 50 meters above. Below that, a second layer of smaller trees and vines created another barrier. At ground level, undergrowth and fallen logs turned every meter of movement into an exhausting struggle. Visibility extended only a few meters in most directions. A soldier could pass within 10 meters of an enemy position and never see it. Movement was slow, noisy, and disorienting. Maps became almost useless because the jungle obscured landmarks. Communication between units became difficult once columns separated. Radio signals weakened under the dense vegetation. The jungle absorbed sound, obscured vision, and turned every clearing into a potential kill zone. American intelligence had underestimated the enemy presence in the area by an enormous margin. Reports suggested the battalion would encounter small Viet Cong units, perhaps a company of 100 fighters or less. In reality, the 9th Viet Cong Division had positioned a full regiment in the area. More than 1,000 experienced fighters dug into carefully prepared positions along the exact route the American battalion would take. These were not irregular guerrillas armed with outdated weapons. They were disciplined soldiers equipped with modern assault rifles, machine guns, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades. Many had fought the French a decade earlier. They had survived years of American bombing and ground operations. They had studied American tactics carefully, noting how U.S. units moved, how they communicated, how they called for support, and most importantly, how they could be isolated and destroyed before that support could arrive. The Viet Cong had chosen their ground with meticulous precision. They knew American units moved in column formation through dense jungle, stretching their formations over hundreds of meters to navigate the narrow trails. They knew American soldiers relied heavily on artillery and air support, which could be neutralized if the fighting occurred at close range under thick canopy, where pilots could not distinguish targets. They knew the Americans would advance with confidence, believing their superior firepower and technology made them invulnerable. Every element of the trap was designed to exploit these predictable patterns. Positions were dug along the trails the Americans would use. Fields of fire were cleared to maximize the effectiveness of machine guns. Escape routes were blocked. Rally points were prepared. The Viet Cong had transformed a section of jungle into a killing ground and waited for the Americans to walk into it. On the morning of October 17th, the battalion began its movement into the operational area. The plan called for multiple companies to advance through the jungle in separate columns, maintaining radio contact and converging on suspected enemy locations. It was standard doctrine, designed to cover more ground and prevent the enemy from slipping away. Alpha Company led the way, moving slowly through the undergrowth along a trail that appeared on maps as a thin line through the forest. Soldiers carried heavy packs weighing 30 kilograms or more, filled with ammunition, water, rations, and equipment. The heat was oppressive, climbing past 35 degrees Celsius even in the shade of the canopy. Humidity approached 100%. Sweat soaked through uniforms within minutes. The jungle was silent except for the sound of boots on the trail, the rustle of equipment, and the occasional call of unseen birds. There was no indication that hundreds of enemy soldiers were watching from concealed positions less than 50 meters away, waiting for the column to move deeper into the kill zone. The first shots came without warning at approximately 1100 hours. Alpha Company walked directly into the carefully prepared ambush area, a stretch of jungle where the Viet Cong had positioned interlocking fields of fire to cover every avenue of movement. The ambush was not a chaotic burst of gunfire. It was a coordinated volley delivered from multiple directions simultaneously, the result of rehearsed timing and disciplined fire control. The initial burst targeted the front of the column and the command element. Soldiers fell immediately, many killed before they understood they were under attack. Those who survived the initial seconds dove for cover, but the jungle offered little protection. The Viet Cong had planned for this. They had positioned their weapons to enfilade the column, firing along its length rather than across it, maximizing casualties with each burst. Machine guns swept the trail. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded among the Americans. The noise was overwhelming, disorienting, making communication nearly impossible, even for soldiers only meters apart. Lieutenant Colonel Allen attempted to respond according to doctrine. He ordered artillery support and called for reinforcements from Bravo and Charlie companies, which were moving along parallel routes several hundred meters away. But the jungle and the intensity of the ambush had severed effective communication. Radio operators were among the first soldiers targeted by Viet Cong sharpshooters who had been trained to identify and eliminate key personnel. Radios were damaged by gunfire and shrapnel. Orders became fragmented, misunderstood, or never received. The battalion, which had moved into the jungle as a coordinated force with clear command structure, was now a collection of isolated groups, each engaged in its own desperate fight for survival with no knowledge of what was happening to the rest of the unit. The Viet Cong did not remain in static positions after springing the ambush. Once the Americans were pinned down and casualties mounted, small teams of fighters moved through the jungle, closing the distance to the American positions. This was deliberate tactical doctrine. At close range, often less than 20 meters, American artillery and air power became useless. Pilots flying overhead could not distinguish friend from enemy under the dense canopy. Artillery forward observers could not call in fire without risking hitting their own soldiers. The enemy had negated the technological advantages that U.S. forces depended on, forcing the Americans to fight at close quarters in terrain they did not understand against an enemy that moved through it with practiced ease. Bravo Company attempted to reinforce Alpha Company, moving toward the sound of gunfire through the jungle. But the Viet Cong had anticipated this response. As soon as Bravo Company entered the engagement area, They too came under fire from concealed positions that had been prepared specifically to intercept reinforcements. The Viet Cong had created a layered defense that turned American attempts to concentrate force into additional opportunities for ambush. Bravo Company found itself pinned down within minutes, unable to advance or withdraw without taking heavy casualties. The jungle that had hidden the enemy now trapped the Americans in a landscape they could not navigate under fire. Soldiers attempted to establish defensive positions, but they could not see far enough to create effective fields of fire. They were fighting an enemy they could hear but rarely see. Lieutenant Colonel Allen made the decision to move forward himself, attempting to reach Alpha Company and coordinate a response from the front. It was a decision driven by desperation and the complete collapse of command structure. Communications had broken down to the point where Allen could not effectively command from his position. He believed his presence at the front would restore order and allow him to organize a coherent defense or withdrawal. Allen reached the forward area but was killed shortly after arrival, struck by enemy fire while attempting to organize soldiers who had taken cover. His death removed the single point of coordination for the battalion. Company commanders were now completely isolated, making decisions without knowledge of the larger situation, unaware that other units were equally trapped and that the battle had evolved into a fight for survival rather than a tactical engagement. The fighting continued for hours, but the outcome had been determined in the first minutes of the ambush. American soldiers fought with courage and discipline, returning fire and attempting to maneuver, but they were fighting blind in terrain that favored the enemy at every turn. Attempts to establish defensive perimeters failed because soldiers could not see more than a few meters ahead and did not know where friendly units ended and enemy positions began. Counterattacks stalled immediately because units could not locate enemy positions or coordinate movement through the undergrowth. Calls for artillery support produced limited results because forward observers could not identify safe targeting areas without risking friendly fire. When artillery did arrive, much of it exploded harmlessly in the upper canopy, unable to penetrate to ground level where the fighting was occurring. The Viet Cong, meanwhile, controlled the engagement completely, moving through the jungle with intimate knowledge of every trail, every clearing, every covered approach. They attacked, withdrew, and attacked again from different positions, creating the impression of a much larger force and preventing the Americans from organizing any coherent response. By late afternoon, as the sun began to angle lower through the canopy, the intensity of fire gradually diminished. The Viet Cong, having inflicted maximum casualties and achieved their objective of destroying a significant American unit, began to withdraw according to plan. They moved quickly and efficiently through prepared routes, carrying their wounded and as much equipment as possible, disappearing into the jungle before American reinforcements could arrive and strength or airstrikes could be effectively coordinated. They left behind a battlefield littered with American dead and wounded, along with abandoned equipment and weapons. The 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry had ceased to function as a cohesive fighting unit. Survivors were scattered throughout the jungle, disoriented, low on ammunition, and traumatized by the speed and violence of the ambush. The final count was devastating. The battalion lost more than 60 soldiers killed and over 70 wounded in a matter of hours, a casualty rate approaching 50%. Alpha Company, which had led the advance, was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. Some squads had been wiped out completely. The bodies of American soldiers lay scattered through the jungle, some not recovered for days because the area remained too dangerous to search thoroughly. The Viet Cong losses were significant but sustainable, estimated at around 100 fighters killed or wounded. They had accomplished their mission, demonstrated the vulnerability of American units operating in dense jungle, and survived to fight again. The Battle of Ông Thanh forced a re-evaluation of American tactics in Vietnam, though the lessons came too late for the soldiers who walked into the jungle that October morning. Intelligence failures, overconfidence in technology, and unfamiliarity with the terrain had combined to produce a disaster that could have been avoided. The assumption that American firepower and training guaranteed victory had been shattered in a few hours of close-quarters combat in conditions where those advantages meant nothing. After Ông Thanh, units operating near the Cambodian border moved with greater caution, used different patrol patterns, and demanded better intelligence before entering areas of dense jungle. But the fundamental problems remained throughout the war: an enemy that chose when and where to fight, terrain that negated technological superiority, and a strategy based on attrition that could not account for an opponent willing to accept heavy casualties to achieve tactical victories. What happened at Ông Thanh was not unique in the Vietnam War, but it remains one of the clearest examples of how misjudgment and terrain could neutralize the advantages of a modern military force. The soldiers who died there were not defeated by lack of courage or skill. They were defeated by decisions made before they entered the jungle, by intelligence that underestimated the enemy, and by a tactical plan that did not account for the realities of fighting in dense vegetation against an opponent that understood the ground completely. They were defeated by doctrine developed for a different kind of war, applied to a conflict where the rules had changed, but the thinking had not. The jungle near Ông Thanh is quiet now. The clearings have been reclaimed by vegetation. The trails have disappeared under decades of growth. But the battle remains a stark reminder of what happens when confidence replaces caution, when assumptions replace intelligence, and when soldiers are sent into terrain they do not understand against an enemy they have underestimated. The trap at Ông Thanh was not sprung by chance. It was the result of deliberate planning by an enemy that knew exactly how American forces would respond, and it worked with devastating efficiency. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and write in the comments what the next video should be about.